In 1940, German engineers saw America's secret jet plans and laughed. They had a right to, but that laughter wouldn't last. Before the P-51 Mustang ruled the skies, America had a dream of jet power. It was a dream the Axis found hilarious, and the reason why changes everything. We all know the Me-262, but what if I told you America had jet blueprints before they saw the British plans? The Axis mocked them, and they were right to. It's hard to truly picture it now, isn't it? To stand in the year 1939 with the world holding its breath on the very brink of a war that would redefine everything. The air crackled with tension, but it also crackled with the sound of engines, piston engines, the roar of a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the thunder of a radial engine. These were the sounds of power, the sounds of survival. Aviation was king, and the king was the propeller. Every nation, every engineer was in a desperate race to make that propeller spin faster, to make those pistons pump harder, to squeeze just one more mile per hour, one more foot of altitude from a technology that was rapidly approaching its physical limit. There was a wall in the sky, a barrier of vibration and physics that the propeller just couldn't seem to break. But in the back rooms of engineering departments, in secret research labs, a different idea was being whispered. A radical, almost magical idea. Propulsion without a propeller. A continuous, violent explosion harnessed to push an airplane forward with the power of a Roman candle. Reaction propulsion. A jet of hot gas. To most, it was the realm of Buck Rogers and science fiction, a fantasy. However, it was not a fantasy, because in Germany, on a secret airfield in Marini, a small, unassuming aircraft had already done it, the Heinkel H-178. In August of 1939, days before the invasion of Poland, that little plane screamed into the sky, powered by a roaring turbine. It was the first, and the secret was held tight. This is the entire context for our story. This is the gap. Germany had the secret, and the rest of the world did not. So you can imagine the scene a year later. German intelligence, flush with victory after the fall of France, got their hands on information. They got a look at what the Americans, the Yankees, were dreaming up in their own secret labs. And they laughed. It wasn't just a chuckle. It was a deep, dismissive, confident laugh. Why? Why the mockery? This is the question at the heart of it all. It wasn't just arrogance, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't just propaganda. It was the cold, hard laugh of a professional watching an amateur try to do a magic trick they've already perfected. The Germans were laughing because they knew the secret to the true turbojet. And they knew from those early American plans that the United States was building the wrong engine entirely. They weren't just on the wrong page, they were in the wrong library. We spend a lot of time digging into these forgotten stories, the technical dead ends, and the secret victories that shaped the world we live in. If you appreciate this kind of deep dive history, the kind that goes beyond the headlines, a simple click on that subscribe button lets us know we're on the right track. It truly helps the channel. To understand the laugh, you have to understand the men who were laughing. And to do that, we have to go to Germany in the 1930s. The situation there was unique. After the humiliation of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden from having a conventional air force. This was meant to cripple them. But, as often happens, restriction breeds innovation. German engineers, blocked from building fighters and bombers, poured their genius into two areas the treaty didn't cover: gliders and rocketry.
This created a generation of engineers who thought differently about air. They weren't just thinking about propellers, they were thinking about thrust. You had men like Werner von Braun, obsessed with liquid fuel rockets, dreaming of the V2 and eventually the moon. But at the same time, another brilliant mind was working on a parallel path, a young PhD student in physics named Hans von Ohain. In 1934, while still at university, von Ohain conceived of a new kind of engine. He didn't know about the work of a young Englishman named Frank-Whittle, who had patented a similar idea years earlier. Von Ohain's idea was, in his mind, entirely new. A machine that would suck in air, compress it, ignite fuel in that compressed air, and blast the resulting hot gas out the back. A continuous, self-sustaining reaction. He even built a crude model in his garage. But a garage model doesn't win a war. Here, fate intervened. Von Ohain's professor, Robert Pohl, knew this idea was too big for a university. He wrote a letter to one of Germany's most powerful and ambitious industrialists, Ernst Heinkel. Heinkel was a legend, but he was also an outsider. He despised the military establishment in Berlin, the Reich Air Ministry, or RLM. He felt they favored his rivals, Willy Messerschmitt and Hugo Junkers. Heinkel was constantly looking for a way to leapfrog them, to make their best piston engine fighters obsolete overnight. When he saw von Ohain's idea, he saw his weapon. He immediately hired the young physicist, gave him a secret lab, and told him, "Build it, and don't tell anyone." This is the alliance that changed history. It wasn't the German government. It was a private industrialist's ambition and a young physicist's genius. While the RLM was focused on the piston engine Messerschmitt Bf-109, Heinkel was secretly building the future. The result was the Heinkel He-178. On August 27, 1939, pilot Erich Wartzitz climbed into the cockpit. The engine, named the HS-3, howled to life. It was a sound no one on Earth had ever heard from an airplane. He took off, flew a circuit, and landed. He had done it, the first man to fly a plane powered by a pure turbojet. So when the war began a few days later, Germany was, in theory, years ahead of the entire world. But here is the first great what if of the jet age. If the Me-262 was so good, why didn't it sweep the skies and win the war? The answer is a cocktail of incompetence and bad luck. First, the engines were unreliable. The Germans were desperate for strategic materials like chromium, nickel, and molybdenum. These were the metals needed to make alloys that could withstand the incredible heat inside a jet engine. Without them, the UMO-004 engines would burn out after just 10 or 20 hours of flight, a catastrophic failure rate. Second, and perhaps most famously, was Adolf Hitler's interference. When he saw the 262, he didn't see a fighter, he saw a blitz bomber. He demanded that this sleek interceptor be converted into a light bomber, a role for which it was completely unsuited. This order, born of ignorance, set the program back months, perhaps a full year. That delay, that single fatal delay, was the window the Allies needed, because while Germany was fumbling its incredible lead, another lone genius was fighting his own battle across the English Channel. His name was Frank-Whittle, and his story is, in many ways, the mirror image of von Ohain's, where von Ohain was a physicist who found an eager backer in Heinkel. Whittle was a career Royal Air Force officer, an insider, but his idea was treated with even more skepticism.
Whittle submitted his thesis on a turbojet engine in 1928. His superiors at the Air Ministry looked at it and their official response was that it was impractical. They couldn't see any military application. They were, just like their German counterparts, entirely focused on perfecting the piston engine. The skepticism was so deep that Whittle couldn't even get the £5 needed to renew his patent in 1935. The Air Ministry literally said it was not worth the money. But Whittle was stubborn. He was a bulldog. If the government wouldn't build it, he would. He managed to scrape together private funding from investors, and in 1936 formed a small company called Powerjets Ltd. His entire team consisted of a few other RAF men working in their spare time in a shed. In April 1937, they ran their first engine, the Whittle unit. It was terrifying. It was a screaming, roaring monster that spat flames and threatened to tear itself apart. It was uncontrollable. But it worked. It proved the concept. Still, the Air Ministry was hesitant. They gave him a tiny research contract, just enough to keep the lights on, but not enough for a full-scale program. This went on for years. Whittle and his tiny team struggled, redesigning, rebuilding, fighting for every scrap of funding, all while von Ohain in Germany was being backed by the full industrial might of Heinkel. It was a classic David versus Goliath story. Then, in 1939, the war began. And suddenly, everything changed. The British government, now facing the very real threat of invasion, was desperate for any advantage. They sent their top scientists to review Whittle's work. They were stunned. They realized that this lone, stubborn RAF officer had, in his shed, built an engine that could change the war. The money tap opened. Whittle was given a contract to build a flight-worthy engine, the WWII, and the Gloucester Aircraft Company was tasked with building a small, simple plane to put it in, the Gloucester E-2839, also known as the Pioneer. On May 15, 1941, nearly 2 years after the German HE-178, the Gloucester Pioneer took to the skies. Allied jet power was born. It was late, but it was real. So now let's take stock. By mid-1941, the board is set. Germany has a massive state-sponsored program with multiple companies working, and the Me-262 is just months from its first flight. Britain has a single, proven engine from a lone genius, and they are now racing to catch up. And where were the Yankees? This is where the story returns to the title. Where was America in all of this? The answer is, they were nowhere. They were completely, totally stuck on the wrong idea. This is the core of the mockery. When German intelligence looked at American research in 1940, they didn't see anything resembling the work of von Ohain or Whittle. They saw something else entirely, and it was, from their perspective, hopelessly backward. To understand what the Americans were building, you have to understand American industry. Just as Germany was defined by its rocketry and glider clubs, America was defined by its mastery of the piston engine. We were the home of Pratt & Whitney, of Curtiss-Wright, of Allison. We were the nation that had perfected the radial engine that would carry the B-17 Flying Fortress across the Atlantic. We were the nation of mass production. Our engineers were titans, but they were titans of a dying age. Their entire focus was on making the piston engine better. And the biggest problem for a piston engine is altitude. The air gets too thin for the engine to breathe. The American solution to this was a masterpiece of engineering. It was called the turbosupercharger. And the company that perfected it was General Electric. Now, why GE? What did an electrical company know about engines? Well, General Electric's main business was building massive industrial turbines for power plants, steam turbines. They understood how to make a finned wheel spin at incredible speeds to compress a gas. A turbosupercharger is, in effect, a small jet engine. It uses the hot exhaust gas from the piston engine to spin a turbine, which in turn spins a compressor, which shoves more air back into the engine. It's a closed loop. It was this device, perfected by GE, that allowed the P-47 Thunderbolt and the B-17 Flying Fortress to fly at 30,000 feet, far above what their engines could do alone.
This was the context for the Yankee jet dream. American engineers were obsessed with the turbosupercharger. It was their solution. So, when they started to think about reaction propulsion, their minds didn't go to a pure turbojet like Whittle's. Their minds went to what they already knew. They thought in two flawed directions. The first was the turboprop. This is an engine that is essentially a turbojet. It sucks air in, compresses it, ignites it, and shoots it out the back. But instead of using that hot gas for thrust, it used it to spin a shaft, which turns a conventional propeller. To the American mind, this made sense. It was a turbine, like their superchargers, powering a propeller, like their fighters. It was an incremental step. The Germans were also looking at turboprops, but they correctly identified them as a compromise, useful for heavy bombers, but not for high-speed fighters. The Americans, in many of their early papers, saw the turboprop as the ultimate goal. This was a critical mistake. But the second idea was even worse. And this is the one that likely caused the most laughter in Berlin. It was based on a concept championed by the Italians called the motorjet, or Campini concept. The Italians actually flew a plane using this in 1940, the Caproni CC-2, and they proudly claimed it was the world's first jet. It was not. The Campini engine was not a true turbojet. It was a Rube Goldberg contraption. It used a conventional 900 horsepower piston engine buried inside the fuselage for the sole purpose of turning a large ducted fan. This fan would suck air in, compress it slightly, and push it out the back. They would then inject a little fuel into the exhaust and light it, creating a primitive afterburner. It was, in effect, a very, very complicated and heavy propeller. The resulting aircraft was a marvel of plumbing, but it was a failure as an airplane. It was actually slower than the piston engine fighter that carried the same engine. It was all noise and no thrust. And this is what American engineers were spending time on. Their pre-Whittle jet blueprints were not for sleek turbojets. They were for massive, complex, heavy hybrid engines. There were plans for planes powered by steam turbines, where a boiler would create steam to spin a turbine, which would drive a compressor. It was, in effect, a flying locomotive. When the German engineers who were already testing the elegant, powerful, and relatively simple UMO 004 saw these American plans for flying steam engines and piston-driven fans, they laughed, and they were right to. It was the laugh of men who had found the internal combustion engine looking at a man trying to build a faster horse. America, the greatest industrial nation on Earth, was on the wrong road, heading in the wrong direction, all because their existing expertise in pistons and steam turbines had blinded them to the true radical simplicity of the turbojet. It's fascinating, isn't it? How an entire nation, the greatest industrial power on Earth, could be so wrong. How the very thing they were best at, the piston engine, became a blindfold. We cover these what-ifs and these crucial turning points of history every week. If that's your cup of tea, you might consider hitting that like button. It truly does help us find more people who appreciate this kind of history. So, how did America, a nation stuck on steam power and complex fans, go from being the laughingstock of 1940 to the masters of the sky by 1950? The entire story of American air power pivots on a single desperate mission. In September of 1940, the Battle of Britain was raging. The Luftwaffe was bombing London every night. Britain was alone and they were desperate. They needed America's help, but they knew the U.S. wouldn't enter the war without a very good reason, and they also knew the U.S. military was skeptical of British technology. So they organized one of the most important and least known missions of the war, the Tizard mission. Sir Henry Tizard, a top British scientist, was sent to Washington on a secret passenger liner. He carried with him a black box full of Britain's most precious secrets. It was a treasure chest of innovation. Inside that box was the cavity magnetron, the breakthrough that would allow for small, powerful radar systems, changing the war at sea and in the air. But buried underneath it was another equally vital prize: the complete blueprints and engineering data for Frank Whittle's Wool-1 turbojet.
Engine. The British delegation met with the U.S. Army Air Corps. General Henry Hap Arnold, the chief of the Air Corps, was a forward-thinking man. He knew pistons were the limit. When he saw Whittle's plans, he instantly understood. This was it. This was the future. He was given the engine. The British, in an act of incredible trust, gave their crown jewel to the Americans. They didn't sell it, they gave it, because they knew Britain didn't have the industrial power to mass produce it while fighting for its life. They needed America's factories. Hap Arnold immediately had a problem. Who in America could build this thing? It wasn't a piston engine. It was a high-speed, high-temperature turbine. And there was only one company in the United States that had any experience with that: General Electric. And here is the beautiful irony of the story. The very thing that had led America down the wrong path, their obsession with the turbosupercharger, was the exact skill set that made them the perfect choice to build the right engine. GE's engineers, who had spent a decade perfecting turbines for piston engines, were the only men in the country who understood the metallurgy and the physics. The Whittle engine was flown to the GE plant in Lynn, Massachusetts. The engineers, led by a man named Donald Warner, took it apart. They were astounded. It was simple, it was elegant, and it was brilliant. They codenamed the project Type 1. Their task was not to invent, but to copy, and to copy it fast. Working around the clock, the GE team reverse-engineered Whittle's design and built their own version, the General Electric IA. By early 1942, they had a functional, American-built copy of the British engine. Now they needed a plane to put it in. The contract was given to Bell Aircraft. The project was so secret, it was given the cover name P-59. The P stood for Pursuit, but the number was deliberately chosen from a defunct project to confuse spies. The plane was the Bell P-59 Airacomet. In October 1942, just over a year after the plans arrived, the P-59 took off from a dry lake bed in California, Muroc Dry Lake, which we now know as Edwards Air Force Base. America was officially in the jet age. But here is the secret. The P-59 was terrible. It was a dog. The GE engines were underpowered, just like Whittle's early models. The plane was unstable. It tumbled in high-speed dives. And most humiliating of all, in mock dogfights, it was consistently beaten by the P-51 Mustang. It was slower than America's best piston engine fighter. When German intelligence eventually heard reports about this new American jet and its lackluster performance, the mocking continued. They were not worried. Their Me-262, which was flying at the same time, was a thoroughbred shark. The American P-59 was a clumsy, underpowered training dummy. And that is the key. The Germans mistook the P-59 for a weapon. It was not. It was America's classroom. Every problem with the P-59, every failed engine and unstable flight was a lesson. GE learned how to build better alloys. Bell learned how air behaved at high speeds. And the Army Air Corps learned how to fly a plane with no propeller. The P-59 was the vital, necessary, failing first step. It was the sacrifice that allowed for what came next. The classroom was about to pay off. Hap Arnold knew the P-59 wasn't the answer. Even as it was being tested, he had already started a new, even more secret project. He needed a real fighter. He needed an Me-262 killer, and he knew exactly who to call.
He called Lockheed, and he spoke to one man, Clarence Kelly Johnson. If you're a student of aviation, you know that name. Kelly Johnson was a man who lived on a different engineering plane from most mortals. He was the mind behind the P-38 Lightning. He was a difficult, arrogant, and uncompromising genius. He was, in short, the perfect man for the job. In June 1943, Johnson was given the plans for the most powerful Allied engine yet, a new British design from de Havilland called the H-1 Goblin. The RLM had given Heinkel and Messerschmitt years. Hap Arnold gave Kelly Johnson 180 days. Johnson, famously, looked at the timeline and said, "That's too long." He promised the plane in 150 days. He gathered his best engineers, walled them off in a circus tent next to the Lockheed factory, and told them they weren't allowed to leave. This was the birth of the legendary Skunk Works. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. They designed the plane, the XP-80, around the engine before they even had the engine. They were working from blueprints. When the H-1 engine finally arrived from Britain, it was too big for the plane. Johnson's team, in a single night, redesigned the entire center fuselage. In 143 days, beating his own impossible deadline by a week, Kelly Johnson rolled out the XP-80, the Lulu Bell. It was sleek, it was beautiful, and it looked fast just sitting on the tarmac. In January 1944, test pilot Milo Burcham climbed in. He pushed the throttle forward. The plane didn't roar like a Merlin. It hissed like a giant kettle. It shot down the runway and climbed into the sky like a rocket. It was a triumph. This was the plane. This was the American answer. Now, the race was truly on. It was early 1944. In Germany, Hitler had finally relented, and the Me-262 was entering mass production as a fighter. In America, the P-80, now named the Shooting Star, was being rushed into production. The question was no longer about blueprints or mockery. It was about time. Could the P-80 get to Europe and fight the Me-262 before the war ended? The answer was barely. In a desperate gamble called Operation Extraversion, 4 P-80s were rushed to Europe in the final weeks of the war in 1945. 2 were sent to England and 2 to Italy. The pilots were under strict orders not to engage German fighters unless they were attacked. The U.S. was terrified of one of its new jets being shot down and captured, giving its technology to the Germans, or worse, to our new emerging rival, the Soviet Union. The P-80s in Italy did fly a few missions, strafing ground targets, but they never saw an Me-262 in the air. The war ended before the 2 greatest jets of their generation could truly meet in combat. So, did the mockery ever truly stop? Did the Germans ever have to eat their words? Yes, but it wouldn't happen over the fields of France. It would happen 5 years later over a cold peninsula in Asia. Because in 1950, when North Korea invaded the South, the P-80, now redesignated the F-80 Shooting Star, was the first American jet to see combat. It dominated the skies. Until a new swept-wing monster appeared, the Soviet MiG-15. The F-80 was obsolete overnight. But America had its next answer ready, the F-86 Sabre, a plane that was a direct descendant of the P-80, but with swept wings based on captured German research. And the MiG-15? Its engine, the Klimov VK-1, was a marvel of Soviet engineering. It was a direct, unlicensed, reverse-engineered copy of a Rolls-Royce Nene engine, which the post-war British Labour government had, in an astonishing act of political naivete, sold to the Soviet Union.
So the skies over MiG Alley in Korea were a battle of American jets derived from British and German designs fighting Soviet jets derived from British designs. The piston age was over. The laughter had stopped. In the end, we come back to the original question. Why did the Axis mock? They mocked because in 1940 they were ahead, years ahead. They had flown a jet while America was still dreaming of steam power. They mocked because America's first Pre-Whittle concepts were flawed. They were hybrid, overly complex, inefficient dead ends. The Germans were on the right path, and America was lost in the woods. But the Axis mistook a slow start for a lack of ability. They laughed at the Yankee dreamers, but they forgot about the Yankee factories. They forgot about the industrial might that could pivot on a dime. They forgot about the American capacity to take a foreign idea, copy it, and then brute force it into perfection through sheer overwhelming industrial power and engineering focus. Germany had the initial genius of von Ohain, but it was crippled by mismanagement and a lack of resources. Britain had the stubborn genius of Whittle, but was crippled by its own government skepticism and a lack of industrial capacity. The Americans? We had the desperation of the British Tizard mission. We had the turbine expertise of General Electric, and we had the focused, undeniable 143-day genius of Kelly Johnson and his Skunk Works. That combination proved unstoppable. The Yankee jet dream was no longer a joke. It became the F-86, the B-47 Stratojet, the B-52, and the entire Air Force that defined the second half of the 20th century. The laughter over Germany faded, and it was replaced permanently by the sound of freedom, a sound that for the first time was a high-pitched scream. The story of Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works is a history in itself, a tale of impossible deadlines and radical designs that led to the SR-71 Blackbird. It's a story we would be privileged to tell, if you're interested. Let us know in the comments if that's a chapter of history you'd like to hear. We've covered a lot of ground today, from von Ohain's secret flights to Whittle's stubborn fight to the flawed steam dreams of the Americans. To see what happened next, when the P-80 became the F-80 and fought for its life in Korea, let us know in the comments section. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.